Again, today does mark that second anniversary, so we will make sure to bring you any updates that we do get right here, live, raw, and unfiltered. Want to get to the latest now out of the Middle East, as the Biden administration has restored a U.S. legal finding dating back nearly 50 years that Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories violate international law. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying the U.S. does believe settlements are inconsistent with Israel's obligations, a reversal of a determination that was made by his predecessor, Mike Pompeo. Blinken's comments came in response to a reporter question about an announcement that Israel would build more than 3,300 new homes in West Bank settlements, essentially in retaliation for a fatal Palestinian shooting attack. I want to bring in Mark Chandler, Director of Government Relations at Coastal Carolina University, a professor of practice, and a former senior intelligence defense official. He joins us every weekend to break down the latest headlines here, and he is here this morning. Mark, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to be here with us.
Good morning, and you're welcome as always, Josh.
All right, so first off, the big question, a lot of people are talking about those comments by Secretary of State Blinken. Can you help kind of break down exactly what they mean and what the deal is here?
Well, basically, what you're seeing is a reversal of the prior administration's policy of really not saying anything negative about how Israel would have settlers go into the West Bank and into Jerusalem and establish new homes and settlements in that area. Not only is it a reversal of the last administration, it's a 180-degree turn from this current administration's proposal back in 2021. Previously, the U.S. has not done anything or said anything negative about how Israeli settlers have gone out there and established these new settlements in these occupied territories. And in just a moment, when I say occupied, I know that has an emotional meaning to that word, but realize that in the 1967 and 1973 Arab invasions of Israel, Israel reconquered these territories from the Arabs as they pushed through those areas. So there's been a lot of turmoil. These are highly charged areas since that time. And what you see also is this is more of a conservative Israeli approach from the conservative side of the government. And the past administrations have supported Netanyahu's move with his conservative coalition here. I don't know if this is true, and this is speculation on my part. I want to be very clear. This could be kind of a signal from this administration to try to weaken Netanyahu and the conservative side of the Israeli government on this, because previously there's been no pushback at this time.
And it is interesting you mentioned that. Again, a lot of us here are kind of taking our own, thoughts of what's going on, and you can read into whatever you want to read into. But, a lot of people are saying that very same thing. Now, I do want to say a report from the UN on Friday said that it identified human rights violations committed by all parties in Israel and the Palestinian territories. The agency is demanding accountability, but at this point, just based on what we've seen with the United Nations and UNRWA, does that report really mean much?
Well, to get to the answer of your question, no, it doesn't mean a lot on the surface. There's no enforcement mechanism that the UN has to really do anything. But when I look through the report, what I find a little disconcerting is it's equal blame for both sides, if you will, if you're looking for a blame mechanism or approach. And this really is a summary of a report that they tasked out before Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th. And so when you look at the details, it talks about how they need to look at attacks on civilian populace, hostage taking, and it points out what Hamas did. However, it equally points out Israel's counterattack to the Hamas attacks, the original Hamas attacks. A little bit more disconcerting is that the author of the report, the director of the human rights group within the UN, said that they need to go back all the way to 1967 and perhaps earlier and look at human rights abuses perpetrated by both sides. Now, that starts to bring in a lot of emotion, a lot of debate that's taken place for decades in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, when you look at that, and among the Arab states. So trying to open it up to that really it isn't going to get anywhere. It's going to create a lot of angst out there and give a lot of both sides ammunition to push back on. So I think it's really disingenuous to start to group in, as the report alluded to, going back decades on this.
And we also learned Netanyahu did unveil that plan for rule over Gaza after the war does end. What do we know about the plan, and why has Hamas come out and said the plan, quote, will never succeed?
Well, I think what Netanyahu's trying to do, and if we look at this and step back just a second, prior to releasing that, he set a deadline for Israeli operations on Rafah. And we've talked about that the last few weekends, where the next step after Khan Yunis and trying to eliminate Hamas in that area is to move to Rafah. And there's been a lot of international debate and pressure on Israel to take care about the refugees that have relocated down to Rafah. Israel has done that. Netanyahu, I think what he's trying to do is put the pressure on Hamas. He set a Ramadan deadline. And Ramadan, for some of the viewers, is the holiest month for the Islam as they work their back. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. When we look at that, so you see that aspect to put pressure to start that campaign. Ramadan starts on the 10th. Laying that over what he just talked about post-governance, I think he's talking now to the future of how the situation is going to play out for the Rafah area. And then you start talking about the holistic governance, post-war governance. He's trying to establish that. So basically, the 4 points are a demilitarized zone. So that's elimination of Hamas, working its way through that process where Israel would establish security. Now, Israel has said, and they haven't changed this, that they do not want to occupy, they do not want troops on the ground to remain in Gaza. So that's an overview of establishing the initial security for Israel. They want to leave behind enough security apparatus within Gaza for them to take care of policing matters and internal security, not an external military capability. They want to close the crossing between Egypt and Gaza. All those crossing points, a lot of tunnels in that area, historically used by Hamas for smuggling operations, weapons, resupply, and financial support. So he wants to close that and put more reliance on where security and resupplies would go through an Israeli border area. I think the Egyptians will go for that. And finally, he's calling for a de-radicalization, if you will, of the education that takes place among the Palestinians. It's coming out, it's proof that the Palestinians, especially Hamas, are pushing an anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli curriculum in their schools, some of those supported through UN schools. So try to balance out the education aspect of that. And here, a key point, he's called on Arab states, much like has been done in Arab states, is to paraphrase what he said. The Arabs, again, do not like the radicalized Islam that you see that Hamas pushes, along with ISIS and some other terrorist organizations. So by doing this, he's asking the Arab states to get involved in this, something that they've been hesitant to do by staking out land. So I think that's starting to bring an international group and put a call out for them. So it's a balanced approach. It's concerned about Israeli security, and it's trying to get that coalition of Arabs to basically step up for once and help out.
We also know Israel has approved sending a delegation over to Paris to talk about the hostage release deal that would lead to at least a temporary ceasefire there. Does it appear that we are any closer to a deal than we were just a few weeks ago, just a few months ago? Because it seemed like after the last deal fell through that there were discussions that were possibly getting close to a deal. Obviously, none of that has come to fruition just yet. Are we any closer now than we were just days, weeks, months ago?
Well, I think the short answer is we actually may be. And I have been hesitant in the past to say that. This has been a diplomatic and an emotional roller coaster for the families of those hostages and for the diplomats involved in this. But what we actually saw yesterday in France, and France is trying to step up and move its way into these negotiations and use a little bit of the influence it has by hosting this. You saw the three key leaders, Mossad, Shin Bet, and the hostage negotiation leader from Israel, arrive in Paris. talking with the U.S., Qataris, Egypt, and France to try to strike a deal. There are actually some statements that came out from members of the Israeli War Cabinet this week that said Hamas may actually be looking at changing some of its demands. So in the past, even though Netanyahu a few weeks ago turned down the offer from Hamas, Hamas's offer really was disingenuous, and they knew Israel wouldn't accept it. So if Hamas does change its approach to how they kind of step through the ceasefire and release hostages, I think you may see a breakthrough in these negotiations. I don't have any information this morning that the Israeli delegation left Paris. So that's a good sign. If they stay there and continue these talks, we may actually see that. I mean, hope's not a plan, in my background, but hopefully we will see some positive movement forward at this time.
We've talked a lot about Israel and Hamas, but I want to go a little bit more into Hezbollah at this point over in Lebanon. What's the latest on the Hezbollah aggression toward Israel?
Well, I want to say that, there's this line, this threshold I've talked about in several interviews where Hezbollah wants to push up to that threshold, but not cross it. That would result in an significant Israeli counterstrike or counterattack. This week, they came pretty close. One of our students in our Center for Applied Analysis here at CCU ran some numbers for me this week. And what we've seen is one of the highest numbers of attacks in a single week from Hezbollah. And so you start to see that uptick in attacks. And what you're seeing is Hezbollah is really pushing up to that threshold that's going to require a significant and overwhelming Israeli counterattack. So they attacked several days this week, a lot of missiles, a lot of rockets, and attempted ground incursions that Hezbollah did, resulting in some Israeli deaths. So that's an increase. Now, Israel did strike back. They went against a UAV factory in Lebanon. They did a strike over in Syria to stop some Iranian resupplies that worked their way through there. So Israel's trying to meet each Hezbollah punch with a counterpunch on that. Also, I think significant messaging by the Israelis was their engineering group cleared out an area to allow a ground incursion into that. So they cleared out a 30-kilometer zone that would allow a rapid ground incursion into southern Lebanon. Now, that does militarily, that supports that, but also it sends a message to Hezbollah that we are preparing to go if you are going to continue these increased attacks. So that's where we are now. It's a little bit more tenuous situation, I think, throughout the week. We'll just have to see if Hezbollah is going to cross that threshold.
All right, so we talked about Hamas, we've talked about Hezbollah. Let's touch on the Houthis now, because it seems as though the U.S. has kind of stepped up what they call self-defense attacks, retaliatory attacks, essentially, against the Houthis there over in Yemen. What do we know about that? But also, does it appear that any of these strikes that the U.S. has conducted on the Houthis have led them to kind of back up, to dial it down a little bit, or are we still seeing that aggression overall?
Well, the last part of your question I'll address first. We haven't seen any dialing down. Again, looking at the numbers from our Center for Applied Intelligence here, this was one of the highest weeks of Houthi attacks on record since they started. So we look at about 14 different attacks. And the interesting thing this week is the Houthis have used just about every different type of capability in their arsenal, from one-way attack UAVs to underwater vehicles. We've seen that. Those are a significant threat to our U.S. naval ships. They've done cruise missile attacks. They've done ballistic missile attacks. They even launched attacks against Israel this week in the southern city of Eilat. So you look at that, this was a significant increase in Houthi attacks this week, one of the highest on record. Now, you use the word, as the U.S. has stated, self-defense. So what that really says is we're not being proactive in our attacks on the Houthis. And that really allows the Houthis to retain the capability to conduct these attacks. And that's why you saw this increase, because if all we're going to do is self-defense, wait until after these are launched, then that's not going to do us very good. That's not going to do commercial shipping. You saw one of the most destructive commercial shipping attacks, almost sinking one ship earlier in the week. The Houthis not only are attacking in the Red Sea, but they're working through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Gulf of Aden. So they've expanded their areas in which they're conducting these attacks. Additionally, at the start of the week, when they launched one of the more deadly attacks or more destructive attacks, if you will, against that commercial shipping, they shot down one of our MQ-9s. That's a reconnaissance capability, one of our unmanned aerial vehicles. It can also be armed if we choose to do that. This is the second one in the last few months they've shot down, and it's also the fourth over time. So while we look at the Houthis as kind of a ragtag terrorist organization, the equipment they're being supplied by Iran, the training, that allows them to maintain this capability. We have to go from the defensive to the offensive and really strike a concerted effort. We can't do a piecemeal attack and expect this to stop the Houthis. They're being resupplied. They're digging in. They're seeing how we're attacking. They are defending themselves and bringing the fight to us as opposed to us taking the fight to them.
All right, Mark Chandler, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to break down the latest headlines here. These developments happening all the time, so we appreciate you being here with us. Anything else you want to add at all before I let you go?
Two things, Josh, if I could. So first off, going back to the U.S. supporting Israel, and do we see a break in that? We are at a tenuous time right now, and I think the U.S., because of its weak approach in the Middle East in this administration, is trying. I will say that early in the week, they did veto that UN resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire with no preconditions. That was really not a good ceasefire proposal by the UN that Algeria brought forward for Israel. So the U.S. tried to stop that. They were the one no. UK abstained again because of their domestic issues with pro-Palestinian protest out there. So we have to look at that. It's a little disconcerting what Blinken said. So we watch that pressure that the U.S. is putting on publicly while we're still trying to resupply them militarily. And then the final thing, not related to the Middle East, I know you're covering it today. You had the report on just before our interview. But, you know, it is 2 years since the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine today. And so we got to look at that and think strategically in the United States of all the pressure that the United States faces and how we're responding overall to the global threats that we have, not just from the Hamas situation, Iranian aggression in the Middle East, but what we see globally and strategically focused against the United States and its allies.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark, as always, for taking the time to be here with us. I love having you on because you're able to break down these topics that we hear about but don't maybe fully understand. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Josh, you're quite welcome, and hopefully we did add a little clarification to things.
I think so.